And I wanted to ask you, Crispin, do you think that standing for drug policy reform and cannabis regulation or normalization, is that something that's coherent with conservative values?
No, I stand for something strange, policy based on evidence. And one shouldn't be, in that sense, prejudging the outcome of the assessment of the evidence. But what's incredibly important is that policymakers in all the areas that where we now have a drug policy that is so far removed from an evidential base as to be almost farcical, driven by the Harry Anslinger approach adopted by the world in terms of prohibition back in 1961. That's in a sense where the original sin now sits that affects 50, 60 years of the absence of research and science in the potential benefits from medicine from cannabis, of medicine from other drugs that we've chosen to prescribe, particularly the psychedelics, where we might be on the verge of a great leap forward in terms of the efficacy of mental health treatment, particularly where you see psychedelics being used in association with psychotherapy, for example. And we've managed triumphantly to turn our back on these by the way in which drug policy has been delivered by the world. And earlier, I think you made a slightly ironic remark about success. Drug policy around the world is a global catastrophe of the first order. And that is in every respect of the medical opportunities foregone, the patients untreated, the driving of patients into kind of steroid treatments that was mentioned earlier. Those are, of course, but the if you like, about the soft end of the catastrophe of the policy. When you get onto the wider issue of prohibition generally, and the criminal justice carnage that's been played out on criminal justice systems throughout the world, and then the victims of those policies who have been victims of the wars between the cartels fighting for the ownership of this business. This business and this demand doesn't go away. The issue is who owns it, and we're only beginning to scratch at the edges in terms of the cannabis industry in Canada, for example, where they've only managed to relieve the illegal supply chain of half the market. It shows the advantage, though, that I thought that contribution of that the legal market has. It's managed to take half the market, despite the fact the quality is worse and the price is higher. People do want to engage with the legal market if they possibly can. And all that needs to be done, there should be enormous advantages if you're a legal producer, because you ought to be able to produce openly under better standards. You can have trading standards and the equivalent, making sure that what is on the tin or the bottle or the pill is actually what is in the bottle or the pill, and so that your consumers and your customers ought to have a hugely greater reassurance. And it should be possible to make this stuff a great deal cheaper legally. If you're then, you tax it stupidly to begin with, and you therefore allow the illegal supply chain to remain in business, it will remain in business. But tax it sensibly at the start point, have as your objective to put the criminal suppliers out of business, and then I think you can achieve those objectives. And you see it around how alcohol is licensed and managed in the United Kingdom, for example, is a classic area where a drug is legalized but licensed and regulated effectively. It produces a very substantial tax take to the exchequer, and there is no illegal industry of any note to rival it, except of course in prison, where alcohol is banned. So I think what we need to do, as far as my profession is concerned, is to change the point of political risk. At the moment, it is risky to do anything in this space because of the anticipated response of tabloid newspapers and others. And I think what we need to change is that if you are going to be associated with doing nothing, you are associated with the deaths that are occurring on our streets in our population from drug users. You are associated with all the people who've not been able to get treatment for their epilepsy, their MS, or whatever the other conditions are that might be available from new treatments. You are responsible from veterans committing suicide because they are not getting access to effective psychotherapy supported by the administration of tiny quantities of products like psilocybin, MDMA, and LSD. And you are standing in the way of bioscience progress in the United Kingdom. You're standing in the way of the adoption of a successful hemp industry in the UK that has a whole bunch of other applications, although much of the value of that product obviously sits in the flower. And so that's where I think we want to change the conversation. And another way of changing the conversation is demolishing the evidence-free basis on which the world moved to the 1961 convention. It was self-evidently racist in how it was implemented and in its objectives. And those arguments need to be made and to make clear. And we need to demolish the position for politicians that they can obviously, because their experience reflects the rest of the population, and probably 80% of them have used illegal drugs and are therefore terrified of this question and will run from it in a screaming hurry. And that if they think that the safe place is going to go onto their moral high mountain and say drugs are bad, they are banned, and then ignore the carnage that is then taking place in the valleys below as a consequence of that policy, they need to be reappraised of their position. They are sitting with a application of a policy that has its roots in racism of a deeply, deeply ugly kind that has caused appalling consequences for the targets of the policy, and the fact that the astonishing number of whether Black Americans or Black Britons who then find themselves in the hands of the criminal justice system, because that is precisely where the policy was designed to place them and where it has kept large numbers of them. That we need to explode the underpinning of the policy, and then we need to get engaged in a conversation about what is the evidence. And if we can proceed on the evidence, then we will be, and we've got to get to a proper place of assessing the evidence. And it's there's a complicated area around having plant-based medicines, and those authorities, those countries that appear to be wrestling with this the best, those that appear to put together specialist authorities, a cannabis authority, for example, that is then going to be responsible for advising politicians and policymakers as to what the right policies will be in this area. What you can't really do is drive a plant through the standard pharmaceutical model that we have now of one molecule on a disease, because otherwise you're going to spend £1 billion like GW Pharma, and eventually 20 years later end up with a couple of products that actually could be hugely improved if you have GPs able to prescribe a cannabis medicine, which is obviously some relation of THC and CBD content that is relevant to the patient. And obviously most patients are individual, and you'll want to go on and aim and adjust the treatment of their disease appropriately. But you can't do it if your pharmacopoeia as a GP is giving you an utterly inflexible solution. So all of these things need to be, questions need to be addressed. And for and whilst in this audience with people who will understand this, I can draw all these together. In the public policy space now, we've got to separate this stuff. So one line has got to be on medicine. The British government licensed medicine from cannabis in 2018 and produced a mechanism for doing so, and you couldn't find an opponent of it in the House of Commons. And this was something that was thought highly risky and almost impossible to do only 6 months before. The fact that the system they put in place simply doesn't work, and hardly anybody's got a prescription on the NHS is another question that then has to be addressed. But it went over the line, and who was against it? Nobody. It's that realization that needs to be applied to the discussion about medicine. We've got evidence pouring out of Canada and states in the US and Uruguay and other jurisdictions who are looking at the legalization of cannabis as a recreational drug. And there, I think in the United Kingdom, we need to not associate those two bits of reform, but keep the medicine in one track, associated with CBD as a wellness product in another, and then a separate track needs to be assessing the implications of what Canada, Uruguay, and other jurisdictions are doing in seeing whether or not it's going to produce the positive overall effects on society, which all of us would anticipate. How successful you are in getting those benefits obviously will depend on the nature of the licensing regime and the regulations you put around you put around the product. And then there is the much larger question of the prohibition of all other narcotics. And for my money, I would like to see a royal commission in the United Kingdom commissioned simply to be asked the question: what are the costs and benefits of the prohibition of narcotics, and make recommendations. Give them as fewer writing instructions as possible, and invite people to actually know and understand all this and have the capacity to assess evidence properly, then to make a contribution to the wider debate as we gradually, if you like, drop any pretense that national global policy in the drug space has produced anything other than carnage and a catastrophic outcome of the first order.
Crispin, I think you should be a regular guest on the People and Psychoactive Plants series. The idea of a Royal Commission, I think, is excellent. I also like what you're saying about looking at political risk of politicians to take a position on this, and the talk about the evidence-based, continuous evidence-based policy. Though I have to say, I've been hearing that term for over 25 years in this space, and the movement has been glacial. But in general, I mean, what you were saying, Crispin, was music to my ears, and I think to everybody else's. You make the case very strongly, and you speak forcefully, and you're very articulate. But I have to repeat my question. Is this a lonely voice in the Conservative Party, or do you find when you are talking privately to some of your members that this is a shared opinion? Is the tide shifting?
Well, one of my favorite activities, if I'm asked to address somebody else's association dinner, and after dinner, all of these Conservative supporters are then sitting at the table. They've eaten their food, they're nursing their glasses of wine as they to try and cope with the pain of having to listen to whoever the visiting speaker is, and then pointing out to them that they are that they're consuming a drug, and then run the parallel. The only difference is it's actually quite a dangerous drug, but it happens to be legal, and we've done the Prohibition Act. We have all the evidence in the United States of what a catastrophe a prohibition of alcohol was, and then it's astonishing a number of people at those events who then come up and say, "Thank you, thank God, someone's saying this," or if they hadn't thought about it, which most of them won't have done, is that's really interesting. I'd never thought about it from that perspective before. There are a few of my colleagues who are of the more sort of condemnatory end of and judgmental end of my party, who would have no sympathy at all with drug users, who, as far as they're concerned, have broken the law, are the authors of their own misfortune, and really, if they die, who cares? Is probably their implicit view. And of course, an awful lot of them are dying in the United Kingdom now because people don't care. But they might be rather more interested in the money that would be saved by having a more intelligent policy, even if we can't change the global context, and we can only go as far as Portugal in terms of decriminalization. The lives saved and the money to be saved is, these numbers are now really very, very substantial indeed. But actually, those people who take that kind of condemnatory view are probably a fairly small minority of people who are prepared to go on the front foot and take that view. The vast majority of my colleagues are silent on this because they're frightened by it. This is a difficult issue because it's going to. I didn't have what David Cameron called a normal university experience, which puts me in a slight minority of my party. 2 weeks after I left school, I was skidding around on a parade ground at a frozen Sandhurst in joining the army. And by the time I went off to university as a serving officer after 3 years training, any relationship with illegal drugs of any kind was likely could have been career fatal. So I avoided it. And was never actually mixed in the circles where illegal drugs were available anyway. It had to be explained to me what PBH meant on the bottom of an invitation to a party, because mine normally said PBAB, which is please bring a bottle, or please bring hash, was something outside my normal experience. But that and so that put me in a place when I became prisons minister, actually to come to this clean, as it were. However, to my colleagues, and I say it's terribly important that your personal experience has nothing to do with how you assess policy and what the right things to do are now. Part of my job is to encourage colleagues to think about this. And the signs are the work we've done over the last couple of years is beginning to have an effect on my colleagues. And I know that there are some, amongst the One Nation group of Conservatives, for example, there's some pretty interestingly radical ideas in the right direction kicking around about how we might progress matters here. And I think we've just got to go on giving my colleagues confidence that they can get into this space, say intelligent things based on the evidence, and it's then not going to be the end of their political career.
Thank you, Crispin. And I hope that when you attend the next PPP event in person, you'll be introduced to some people who will be able to provide you with some of these substances that you haven't yet tried. Because I think personal experience is a very important sort of way of coming to an opinion about a subject.
Well, my advice to colleagues now is you should say nothing about your own personal use or experience, because it is nothing to do in that sense with the wider policy debate. What you've got to do is whatever experience you do or do not have is not relevant to your role as someone who is influencing a public policy.